Oh, it's sexy, isn't it? It
I
really
do,
is.
yes. I also really like the song.
Don't you just like the fact that, Wise Words has been embodied now by a little promotional video. There you are, guys. It's yours now. Yeah, sexy. Love it.
So perfect. So today, what's on the agenda then, Tristan?
We're doing another very short introduction, and we're doing it to Rhetoric.
Yes. Who's this by again? I'm gonna butcher it.
Oh, I literally just had it. It's Richard Toye.
Toye.
If that's how you say his last name, I don't know. Apologies if that's wrong, but yeah.
Did we ever do a proper introduction to what these kind of books were? We kind of did, didn't we? In terms of they're just.
I think we wrote down a little bit. I can't remember if we we did do a brief one for the first one, which was it philosophy?
I'm wondering whether it's worth just touching on it now, just because we could almost do the same for every single one.
Yeah.
But essentially, this is a book series by, I believe, Oxford University Press.
Yeah.
And it's, as it says in the title, a very short introduction to a specific topic. So this week is rhetoric. We've covered philosophy in the past. I think we covered philosophy of science. What else have we covered?
We tried to do philosophy of law, and that was way over our
that
was
a bit deep, wasn't it?
And then we did Jung, and I think this is the next one.
Forgot Jung was the last one. Yeah.
And
the overview is we kind of go into these things realistically with little knowledge, in the sense that, I haven't really read too many books on rhetoric. I don't think you have either.
No.
And this is like a primer into a topic that we know little about, so to speak. So
it works well because we're also going to be doing a lot of books on communication.
Yes.
So, it's going to come up a bunch of times in the next few books that we're going to do.
I was going to say this is a bit more planned now, isn't it? Like this is kind of relevant to the following books, which are mainly around communication. And as I guess we're going to find out, rhetoric is a form of communication, I guess. I mean, it's one of those big blanket words that kind of covers a lot of ground, if that makes sense. Because I almost thought the word rhetoric itself almost covers like forms of persuasion or just persuasion in general.
Yeah.
So yeah, should we?
Cool.
Should we dive in?
Let's get into it, shall we?
Okay, right. Let's stick to this structure we started again. So we're going to skip the sort of synopsis of the book, because essentially the synopsis is the overall introduction to rhetoric, which you just said. So yeah, I personally can't remember too much about the brief history. I didn't really enjoy that first chapter, but if you can take away what you can remember, because I remember it was talking about how sort of rhetoric sort of came about in the time of sort of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Like, thing is that once again, it is trying to condense so much stuff.
Well, like the whole history, like the history of rhetoric, right?
Yeah,
into
exactly.
Like 10, 15 pages.
So I think like what I kind of abstracted out of that was that it's just this tool that can be used in many different ways and takes on a different life form or different shape depending on the era that it's in, the technology that it's used, the field that it's used in, and who's using it and for what purpose. So each time it kind of changes, and he talks about, it like you just said, that originated during the Greek times with Plato and Aristotle, and Plato used a lot of it to try and describe his kind of arguments or use it. And then I think it was very much taken on by a guy called Cicero as well. But then like I just said, like it completely changes depending on who's using it. So, a prime example that he uses in this book is like Second World War, and how Hitler would use it, or Stalin would use it, and how basically, certain techniques were used to try and persuade, whether it's the audience or Houses of Commons or, whoever's listening, but it's always kind of directed at something.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, because you said something earlier, which was like, it's a tool, it's essentially a tool of persuasion. Am I right to sort of, because kind of that's what I've extracted from it completely. It's like a communicative tool to persuade.
Exactly. I think the exact definition, or the definition that is normally used, is that it is the art of persuasion that is used either in speech or written text, and that's so it's quite a broad definition.
It's very broad, but then
a lot. But
I guess as we get into this, so specifically like the Five Canons and stuff, if you look at that, there's a very broad overview of just communication in general. It takes it from the sort of macro, like what are you trying to say, what is the structure, to the little mini bits, which is like the sort of the techniques you can use, so to speak. But yeah, should we move on to the 3 branches of oratory then?
Yeah, let's do it.
If you can go ahead, and I'll add stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I basically just put these points down. I don't think basically the 3 branches of oratory is like, oratory is the art of practice of formal speaking in public, right? And so they kind of, or what Aristotle used to do is break it into 3 branches. So one of them was forensic, another one was epidietic, and another one was deliberative. And each kind of takes on their own kind of is used in a different context. So forensic or judicial is another way that they describe it, is used in like a courtroom or legal context. Epidietic is concerned with like praise or blame, and deliberative is kind of used to persuade a group. So for example, like voters or legislators, or, it's normally used in politics, but those are the 3 branches. And just by trying to understand the structure, how people have conceived rhetoric over the years, I don't think this is so much used today in like our modern understanding of rhetoric, but it's definitely what Aristotle used to use it as.
Yeah, this is kind of where I was thinking when I was reading, obviously, the notes. I was just thinking there is more to it than just these 3 areas. Like, for example, I would argue there's one towards, sort of saying here, there's one that's found, or a form of oratorial rhetoric in the courtroom. Then you've got obviously the one to do with like blaming somebody, and you've got one to do with, like you said, trying to persuade people to action. There's also, for me, an obvious one in the day and age of trying to convince people of your particular character, which wasn't mentioned there, because obviously that's a form of persuasion, persuading people to see you as something you're not. But then you have to remind yourself, similar to what you were just saying then, which is this was Aristotle's like categorizations back before maybe self-image wasn't part of them, back before we were self-obsessed, as we found out in Selfie. That was less about it. It was more about sort of punishment, blame, more about sort of justice.
External,
so I think it's interesting to remember as well. When I was reading this, I was just thinking, because obviously this is very much taken from a lot of Aristotle's writings, right? So it's like, and not much has been added to it since, yet the game of rhetoric has changed so drastically. And I thought it was quite interesting, because later on in the book he talks about like contemporary rhetoric theory or whatever. And it's interesting just to think that sometimes, maybe the principles that have stood the test of time are becoming a bit outdated to a degree.
Well, I agree. I think what's interesting is that, like, rhetoric basically just talks about persuasion, right? And any argument involves persuasion of some kind. Okay, which means that it is everywhere. The difference is that it's whether we've dissected something and tried to understand it. The only things that we know is like, this is rhetoric, or this is the evolution of rhetoric, is based on what we have dissected, what arguments we have looked at, to be like, okay, let's pull this apart. Let's look at the structure, this, and this. And so it's just interesting that, like, there's so much of a period of history that we probably haven't looked at. And so that hasn't been able to add to the evolution of rhetoric. And so it almost has made this big jump from, like, back in that time when it was like seen as an actual academic, aspect. And then it just wasn't used apart from in like daily arguments.
I guess it was very functional as well, like, because obviously you've got the television now, you've got text. A lot of the oratory, and this, like, part of the reason why it's such a prime part of the rhetoric back then was because that's probably the personal only way you could persuade people, just through speaking and obviously structuring your speech. And then obviously back then the only time you would probably need to speak was in those contexts, such as blaming or praising, obviously finding justice in a court of law, or obviously persuading people to action. Those are like the 3 functions of speech, right? And then obviously since then we've had many changes to the point now sometimes it's just you speak just for entertainment. I mean, think of a comedian.
Well, it reflects our society, doesn't it? It's like, think about what's propped up since, or that has been around since then. But like religion, that's one. It's like, how do you convince people that your beliefs are real? And now it's like you have capitalism, so everyone's trying to sell and buy something. Well, that involves some kind of transaction, some kind of persuasion. So it's like, it's manifested in different ways depending on kind of like the culture that we're in.
Of course. I think on that kind of note, I really want to go below the 5 canons and go towards the three appeals, because I think that's kind of related to what you're just saying.
Yeah.
If you want to go ahead with it, or I can.
You go ahead, mate.
So the 3 that I got, he's got different forms of it. He's got the forensic. So these are the 3 appeals that he makes, or you will make when you're trying to convince somebody. So there's the forensic, the epidietic, right, and the deliberative.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember which one's ethos. Is it epidietic?
So I'm not sure. Do they correlate as much? I thought basically the way that I interpreted it was that the 3 branches are like dependent on the context with which you're using it.
Okay.
And then the 3 appeals are like, if I'm trying to persuade you of something, what part of you do I appeal to? So whether that's your character, your logic, or your emotions, right? And I think, we all have to be kind of adaptive to whatever context we're in, but depending on which context and then how you want to convince something, that's which ones you kind of pick. And you can pick, I think there's a point in the book which says, it's not just you choose one and none of the others. It's like you can choose all of them.
You can mix and match kind of thing as you go through your argument, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. To be honest, the forensic and the epidietic and the deliberative kind of, for me, I stuck more to the ethos, pathos, and logos because it kind of just made a bit more sense. So if I remember it correctly, logos is obviously trying to argue through reason and fact, trying to convince somebody of something by telling them something that's meant to be true or that they can think through. Am I right to think pathos is the character, is ethos the character? Ethos is character, isn't it?
Ethos is character. Pathos is emotions.
Is emotion, yes.
Is logic, yeah.
So pathos or pathos, however you want to pronounce it.
I don't
even know how to pronounce it, bro. It's probably I bet you're something weird where it's even like pathos or something like that. That's to do with persuading via emotion. So I guess using emotional stories, for example, to try and persuade somebody for an action or appealing to their emotion, their maybe humanity, so to speak. Then obviously you've got the ethos, which is appealing to character. So, kind of going like, I'm a trustworthy person, like trying to convince somebody through that, like a characterological basis. Like these guys are bad people, so you can't trust them. That type of thing is that type of argument, which I thought was quite interesting because it's quite true as well that language kind of disguises these things, or people say stuff which insinuates it, if that makes sense. So, I mean, if you're looking at the modern day rhetoric of COVID and stuff, a lot of the rhetoric is actually, I guess you could say, ethos and pathos as well. So it's a mix of both. It's not logos at all in terms of like if they're not arguing to you through they claim they're arguing to you through data, but a lot of it is obviously like you're not saving lives, you're killing people. So that's an ethos. Pathos in the sense that and then ethos in the sense that like, oh, if you don't do your bit, you're a bad person essentially. And I just found it quite interesting because if you really think about a lot of arguments that you have, even with other people, they can roughly be boiled down to like, how are they trying to convince you to do something? Is it like your character? So they could be saying something, oh, it's not like you to do that. That's an appeal through your character. They could tempt you by saying how good you're going to feel in the evening. That's, I guess, an emotional ethos, I guess, so to speak. Or they could try and tease you with, I don't know, some details of the event. And that, if that really gets you going, I don't know, through the logos.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because with our understanding or our improved understanding of like how our attention systems work, and especially with if I want to sell something to you, what's the best way of grabbing your attention? If we understand how we can grab your attention, then that's what I'm going to take advantage of. So we know that like threats or kind of emotional aspects are kind of picked up quicker than logic and fact, because you have to actively pay attention.
I would also say the characterological stuff as well, because it means this person's, you got to be wary of them, if that makes sense. So like if you label somebody as like evil or bad, they're like, I don't know, painted with a brush now that you can never unsee that, and that you're going to be wary, always constantly wary of them.
No, exactly. And so it's just quite interesting how it's probably rhetoric is used today with this kind of understanding. Because it's like, think about like implied messages or what's called implicit meanings and stuff like that. Every time you look at a billboard and there's loads of different things you don't actively see, but it's still grabbing your attention and changing your perspective.
It's funny as well with the implicit stuff, because it's my understanding is you can't get like sued for making implicit claims or like claims which aren't obvious. Like if you said, I don't know, if Lynx deodorant, for example, went, yeah, if you spray yourself with this, you're going to literally sleep with every single girl on the street that you walk down with, you would obviously say that's bollocks.
Yeah.
But then they just showcase a guy spraying on walking down the street, and obviously loads of like really attractive females come jump on them, and it's implied, yet they're still making a claim in my head. It's just an implied claim.
Yeah.
And we're all like, we're not all, we don't believe that to be the case, but it kind of sits with our subconscious that might possibly happen. And I find it fascinating how, like you said, you can do these like implicit or underlying sort of messages which aren't exactly articulated or, clear, let's just say.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think there's something that popped up earlier on that I was thinking about is on the emotional front, on the pathos. Think about what we were talking about ages ago. I can't remember which podcast, but in terms of like Russell conjugations.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember like the idea of like, changing something and then adding kind of emotional language that's kind of directed in a sense? Which is just a pure rhetoric.
Well, that is pure. You're right. No, that is rhetoric. It's pure. I think as well, I remember when I was reading this short introduction, he did bring up George Orwell. Do you remember that bit right at the end? It was saying something like he was the far end of a particular viewpoint of rhetoric, which was like he was so against anything which wasn't direct and clear. If that makes sense. I think that was his position on it. Always like anything that you start adding sort of superfluous stuff on it, like you said, sort of doing the Russell conjugation where you sort of you frame things in a way like, oh, they were, I'm trying to think of an example. I'm going to get an example now.
I can't think off the top of my head, but it was interesting, like what he was saying about George Orwell, because he said, like you said, George Orwell likes everything being clarified, right? So that there's no kind of ambiguity to get around something. But what's interesting is that with he gives like Animal Farm for an example, and that's one giant analogy for Stalinism.
Yes.
So it is playing on ambiguity in a sense.
Yes.
Or that there's not like clarity to an issue. And I think something to take from that is that it's always based on who you're trying to persuade and who your opposition is and who you're appealing to, right? And every context with whatever that is, you have to adapt, right? So you can't use the same method for every single opposition, everyone that you're appealing to. And so it's got to be changed. So like, in some of George Orwell's work, it's very different and it's very like on the nose, and some other stuff is very kind of ambiguous and slightly deceiving, but is obvious, the plausible deniability and be like, no, it's actually about a farm. Then actually it's not, it's about Stalin.
Well, that's part of the ambiguity of language to a degree, isn't it?
Exactly.
I've found a couple of examples of this, which he talks about. The examples he's given here is like, I am firm, you are obstinate, he is a pig-headed fool. What I find, what it is it's like exaggerating the situation or exaggerating something to make it like it's really bad. So like, for example, I could say I have reconsidered a matter. I could say you have changed your mind, or I could say he has gone back on his word. The point being, they all describe the same thing, which is the person has changed their opinion on something, or you've changed your mind. But the one of them is like you've broken a contract, for example, you've gone back on your word, which is essentially what they all are to a degree. But one of them obviously creates that emotional reaction to it, like he is a liar, because that is a rhetoric appeal there to the character of the person. So instead of saying he's changed his mind, which could be seen as a positive characterological trait, he's now seen as somebody who has gone back on their word.
Yes, exactly. And actually that does relate to something that he talks about in this book, because he talks about definitions and how you shouldn't accept the opposite. Well, you shouldn't accept the opposition's definition of something. You can agree with certain aspects of it, but then you define how you interpret something so that it's made and defined on your baseline. Yeah. Right. Because if you resort or you conform to someone else's definition of something, then you're on their playing field.
Yeah. They control the frame, right? It's classic debating, isn't it? Exactly. It reminds me of the how to, I know we always refer back to it, but the how to have impossible conversations, because I'm pretty sure I had something similar to that, which was like, make sure you define things up front in terms of define what it means to yourself first, right? Because otherwise you can argue for days and days about something, such as like, I think the examples they were using, which is like vague concepts, such as like, big government, big pharma, like it's quite vague. So you could basically, one person could be arguing about the fact they're like record breaking profits, and one of them could be arguing about the backhand stuff I don't know they're doing. Do you kind of get what I mean? Like it means different things to different people. And I remember that was a good point. And I do think what you're saying there about the controlling the definitions is also part of what rhetoric is, which is I'm going to kind of step on it now, but it's like the metaphors and similes. It's like you can control the frame by controlling the metaphor that people use.
Yeah.
And a lot of what's his name, George Lakoff, who wrote the metaphor book, he wrote another book like Don't Make You Think of an Elephant or something like that, and he talks about how the frame, like obviously the framing of things impacts people's feelings towards something, like the idea of inheritance tax fees, death tax, and stuff like that. The way you just call it, makes people change their opinion on how they feel about something just by the name. And that's kind of what you mean by like the definition, I guess, in a way. It's like if you can use a different word to describe the same thing, similar to that emotive conjugation where it's, you've gone back on your word. If you can frame it in a way that's unpleasant, you could be made to look the bad guy, or you could be persuaded. Whereas obviously what you're saying there, which is if you could define it on your own terms, you'd be like, hang on a second, I didn't go back on my word, or hang on a second, I didn't do that. It's like this. At least then you kind of bring it back to how you see the event or see whatever happened.
You want to have some element of control for what you're arguing about. If you're in a safe place or a comfortable place with which you can argue from, then, then all you have to worry about is like your argument rather than backing up, or like retorting other people's arguments. You kind of want to be able to be in control and kind of directing it forwards rather than catching up with everything.
Like you said, playing on your own terms. It's because it's funny, isn't it? We kind of accept, if you're having like an argument or something, you kind of accept other people's what's the word, like their frame on things without realizing you've ever done it, if that makes sense. Somebody could tell you something's like something else, and without you ever being, hang on a second, it is, but it's also like this. You then end up having the battle on their ground, like you just said. Like you end up, trying to persuade people on the stage which they've set, which obviously favors whatever they're going to say.
I think and it's probably quite difficult to, unless you're like aware of these kinds of things. Most of the time you wouldn't even realize that you're in someone else's frame, or that someone who's talking to a group of people has set out a certain framework and you're not even aware that you've kind of conformed to it, right? You have to actively step back and be like, look, there may be loads of other ways of looking at this. This is my frame. This is how I'm going to see it. And, if you want to be able to persuade people, you want to be able to persuade them of this frame, of your frame.
This has got me quite interested in potentially going into debating. Like reading around debating.
I tried to do it at uni. I tried to sign up for something, but it wasn't really what I was looking for, because they wanted you to go into schools and teach the importance of debating, even though you haven't debated yourself yet, which I didn't quite understand. I was like, you're going to teach me the importance of it, but I'm not actually going to do it. I'm just going to teach others. So but there's a thing called like Toastmasters that my mate
I'm familiar with it.
Does. And I really want to like start doing like proper debates. I think it's
public speaking Toastmasters, isn't it? Public speaking. Yeah.
I think they're all over the world. There's probably loads of other things as well, but that's the only kind of one that I know off the top of my head. Yeah,
mate, go for it. I was going to say there must be a short introduction to debating, or even just a book on it, because I think we should if we're going into this communication stuff, that's definitely one we should touch on.
Yeah, I agree. We can have a look after this, actually.
Perfect.
But I think then moving on, there's we should probably touch on the Five Canons.
Yes.
We keep saying that. People are like, what the fuck are these Five Canons? But basically this is like the structure of rhetoric. So these kind of 5 aspects or 5 elements of what rhetoric is made up of, and how improving on all of these will improve on your rhetoric ability. So that's invention or discovery, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Do you want to elaborate on these, or?
Yeah, I some of them stick to my mind better than the others. I'm going to kind of go off your notes here and kind of roughly gauge where I was at with it. So the invention discovery. So that for me was more coming up with the overall thing you're trying to pitch. That's almost like that is technically the first stage, right? It's the coming up with what is the issue you're trying to like communicate. What are you trying to communicate? And potentially what's the correct frame. So I guess part of the invention part is coming up with the frame of the communication point that you're trying to say, which will convince people. Then you've got arrangement. So that's the structure. So that's I guess the way you structure your sort of in the form of a speech, how you sort of start, how you finish. How are you arranging the different sort of mini techniques that you're going to learn later inside? Style, that's the choice of words. Are you going to be, I guess some people, it's funny as well that Tony Robbins, for example, he swears a lot when he does his when he does his big, like personal development courses. But that's a form of his style, right? Because basically I think what happens with that is people expect a certain style, and then by swearing, he kind of takes people's attention, because you're like, I've just broken like a social convention, like you guys have all paid thousands of pounds here and I'm just going to trash talk, and it kind of gets people into like, oh, hang on a second. Memory, okay. The memory part,
I thought it was a bit weaker, but
it's to do with just remembering your speech, right? So you can come across as more sort of quick-witted, which is almost like coming across as more professional, I guess, or more prepared when you're speaking or when you're doing a rhetoric. And then delivery is the other parts, such as your tone of voice, your body language, I guess, the speed at which you speak, I can imagine, is also part of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as you can already tell, so there's 5 canons, but then if you look into each canon, there's already like 3 or 4 different criteria. So you could almost call it like the 15 canon. But yeah, did you get anything on top of that? I mean,
I think that's pretty clear. Like, I pretty much got the same things. I think the idea is that you've got to try and figure out, like you said, what you're arguing about, or what your argument is, or the main issue that you're trying to approach. And then you can start to, add on the other layers,
the idea you want to say comes first, right? Like you can't just like arrange random English to explain something that, you don't know what the overall point is.
Yeah. And it's very similar to like essay writing in a sense. You've got a goal, you need to try and explain something, show your arguments for both sides, and then have a conclusion. And that's why you have that structure there, right? And then on top of that, then you have style, how you put the words together to express what you want to come across. And then what I did, the thing that I did like about the memory aspect was, when someone's listening to an orator or someone speaking, they're judging multiple aspects of it, right? The words that he's saying, the way he's saying it, the character himself, right? And I think they talk about that in terms of implied author or implied speaker or something like that. And so if you have a great memory, what he was saying is that, if you can remember all this stuff and you don't have to look down at your sheets of paper and remind yourself all the time, it looks more natural.
Yes.
And that in itself is just like, you see a character as someone who's very natural and who has it all, who's very quick-witted and hasn't planned all of this. And I think that goes in your favor.
No, 100%, mate. I happened to see somebody earlier on who was like trying to do like an advertisement, who's like an influencer, and they were like reading off their, like you could see them like reading, like, this is great.
Yeah.
And then they'd be like, you should buy this. Yeah. I was just like, this is the most insincere, like, get off the screen. At least you can, it was only like 50 words. All you could have had to do is just read it a few times and at least just come off the cuff, for God's sake.
But the thing is that I can relate to this a lot in terms of like acting, right? It's like, you're going to, if you're going to hire someone to do a job, right? First of all, there's different levels. Okay. So you get auditions that are very last minute. And so you can take in a piece of paper, but the whole idea is to maybe look and then try and act outside of the piece of paper, right? Then you can learn the lines, but you need to then learn them pretty well. And then you add emotions, and then you add actions and all these kinds of different things. And each layer gives more depth and meaning and sustenance to it,
Yeah, of course.
And the same thing goes for like, you look at some politicians and they're way better than others. Have you seen that? Have you seen that video of Boris Johnson talking about Peppa Pig for like 10 minutes? It is.
I've seen
funniest
thing where he just loses his like plot, doesn't he? So he just starts
loses
shouting absolute crap, doesn't he?
Yeah, mate, it's so funny. Oh my God! But my point being is in like some people are really good at that and like can do it off the cuff.
Yeah, can
work
sort of make it up
their,
as they go along. Whereas that's what comedians I think are very good at in particular.
So I made this note actually. I think it is very important to be able to do that because you convey this. Yeah, stand-up comedians. There are. I've been going a bunch of times recently to the one in Central London. Top Secret Comedy Club or something. And it's interesting watching different types of comedians, because there's like, the way I see it, there's like three components, right? You have like people with great content, people who are great with the audience, and people who can do both. Okay. And it's so interesting when you see someone that like is terrible with the audience, and, you know, they just can't work off them whatsoever. And the only thing that they're banking on is their material being good. But whenever that like structure breaks down for even like a second or a minute, they're just frozen and they just can't react. And they're like, you know, and it breaks that whole facade, because what you're doing, like you said before, with frames, you're basically painting an illusion or a facade that like, this is the way it is, this is my point, and this is the way that the world should work, you know, and you want people to believe in that. And the more
you're right, and then the moment you kind of start, you look like you're quivering in your pants, people start going, oh, maybe this guy isn't so funny, because part of the part of the appeal of comedy is the effortlessness of making people laugh. Exactly. If somebody stands on the stage and looks frightened, it's never a good sign. Like that's enough to make everybody else frightened for the person on the stage. So and then, you know, the last layers of delivery, exactly what you're saying, like accent, posture, gestures, tone of voice, all that kind of stuff is very important. But they're like the last kind of layer, I would say. I think similar to what you were just saying, they all kind of build on each other a little bit, don't they? Yeah. Like you can't even have the memory if you don't have the overall point, and then also the arrangement of the words. So it all kind of like rattles down a little bit. Yeah. But yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, so then I think moving on to basically like techniques.
Yeah. So these are sort of the I guess techniques is the word. I was trying to think of another word. It doesn't make any sense to use another word. But like many smaller techniques than the sort of five canons, right? Yeah. So he talks about two pretty cool ones, which is metaphor and simile, which is, you know, describing with simile, it's like describing something like something else, whereas metaphor is describing something as something else. So like compared to they screamed like a lion, these they roared as a lion or something. I can't remember how exactly it was phrased, but you know what I mean. Or like saying time is money. So instead of saying time is like money, your time is money. Yeah. That's the difference between the two. But I think we've already talked before on podcasts about metaphors, but obviously it is probably one of the most important parts of rhetoric in my opinion, in terms of the, you know, the whole, it frames like something through a whole load of associations. So what I mean by that is, you know, if you framed, let's just say the stuff going on, I always use this one, but Ukraine and stuff going on at the moment, when you go like war is like a dance, or diplomacy is like a dance or something similar to that, you kind of frame like an idea of like two people collaborating. These, you know, if you're saying it's like a, you know, war is like a battle, it's a bit more combative, right? It's the images gone in or that appear in your brain are a lot different when it's a dance versus a battle. And that's the whole point of metaphors. It's the way they say something then makes you think of all the different possibilities related to the concept that they frame something in. And actually what I butchered it then, what I was trying to say was love is a battle versus love is a dance. And that's the two different ones, right? Yes. And it's, you know, it's like the story of somebody's love journey. It can be described as a battle from the fact that sometimes you argue with your partner, let's just say, and it is a bit like a battle, but then there's also times where it's like a dance. Yeah. So it's both. It's just the one the one you choose to use frames the associations people make.
Exactly. Exactly. There are so many ways to view something, and metaphors basically highlight different angles, and you're basically trying to make your audience, or, you know, see that particular angle and be like, this is what I'm going to focus on. You go to look.
It takes the complex and makes it simple in the sense that it gives you ready-made associations. It's a bit like, you know, it's a bit like some of the stuff going on in politics at the moment, where they just, you know, they label somebody as something, which basically makes the complex reality that this person could be something more than just an anti-vaxxer into they are an anti-vaxxer, they're evil. If that kind of makes sense, you frame it in a way. Yes, exactly. Like in fact, that's my favorite one at the moment they use is like conspiracy theorist anti-vax, because the moment you get labeled as that, no matter what you believe, you're just you're completely sidelined, no matter what. Because
the same thing was like all
these, you know, like associations with that. It's like anti-vax. Okay, they want to, you know, they don't want to save people. They're selfish. You've got the conspiracy theorist. Okay, they're cuckoo. So it's like the ultimate, like, don't listen to these people, don't trust them. They're horrible. They're the enemy type thing. And it's crazy, isn't it? Because that once again frames something.
It's nuts, isn't it? It's like there's always so much complexity to something, and yet we try to break it down and make it seem as simple as possible. And, you know, like a prime example that I'd say that's happened over the last couple of years is like, you know, take Trump for an example. Okay.
Yeah.
Not even like no one can deny that like you can't say that every single thing that he said was wrong, right? He could have said the smallest thing that was right. Okay. And someone could agree with that smallest thing. But if you agree with one tiny thing out of 99% of what he said, then you're a Trump supporter, which means that you're associated to everything that a Trump supporter.
Yeah, people don't like
and then you're anti-vax, and then you're conspiracy theorists, and then it's just a massive way to tarnish someone's whole kind of identity or character. And that's, I guess, ethos, isn't it? Like that's a tactic in itself that people will be like,
it is ethos for sure. It's like it's weaponized. That language is weaponized right now. The whole. You're right. I do find it fascinating that you can use just by basically, you know, simplify somebody to one stance, which then basically stands for something, which then, in fact, we're going to talk about this later, where rhetoric uses symbols, which I guess you could argue that Trump is a symbol, or an anti-vaxxer is a symbol. A conspiracy theorist is a symbol. It's a symbol of the collective like idea of what that is. And the collective idea of what these things are is usually negative. But the reality is somebody could be a conspiracy theorist, an anti-vaxxer, a Trump supporter, you know, God forbid any of these things, but also be something more than that, which is something more than just you know, they don't care about anybody. They're selfish, you know, they're cuckoo. They don't know anything about the world. They're racist, you know, all these things which are just planted onto these symbols, which not necessarily are, you know, representative of the people who are in. Don't get me wrong, there probably are some people who are literally all the things you're claiming.
Literally tick every one of those boxes.
But they usually are on the fringe, and they usually are way less common. It's a bit like the anti-truck. Have you seen the stuff in Canada I was talking about? Like,
I don't know much about it. I keep hearing about it, and my parents talk to me about it, but I don't really know what's going on.
My favorite thing was the media tried to brush them. This is like classic like rhetoric, just like they're conspiracy theorists, they're anti-vax, and it turns out like 98% of them are vaccinated. It's just like you absolute douchebags. Like I don't get me wrong, I don't really know where I completely stand on all of it. I think it's just like when I see somebody blatantly misuse language like that to try and create an impression of a group of people, I immediately just think, and then get proven so badly wrong. It's just like, you got to put your hands up at this point and be like, yeah, fair enough. We shouldn't have called them anti-vax because they're 98% vaccinated. Like,
but you can understand that, like, you know, that is just a method or a technique of getting what they want, rather than it being based on the truth whatsoever. It's not like they're working from a place of truth and then using these techniques. They're just going like, look, we want this to happen, so we're going to just start using these techniques and for our own good, weaponizing them. And that's why, like, it comes back to this idea that, you know, at the beginning of this book, it was kind of interesting because he was talking about how rhetoric has got like a bad rap, and how, you know, it's known as like the politicians speak and all of this stuff, but it's that because it's weaponized by certain people. It is a tool at the end of the day. You know, anything can be used for bad or good. Social media can be used for good. It can also be used for bad. You know, it's the same thing with like this. Speech can be weaponized in many different ways, and it's kind of ironic that it always pops up with politicians. I wonder why that is. You know, why are the politicians known as being...
Well, I also guess that they are the only ones who have to mass persuade, which is where rhetoric comes in,
that's
right?
A good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
But at the same time, there has to be values above just pushing agendas to a degree. And which is the whole point of this Constitution of America, for example, like the freedom of speech and stuff. The whole point was there's like values that are beyond, you know, control, which is allow people to say what they believe, kind of thing, even if it is not what you want to hear. But yeah, we kind of got sidetracked from the sub techniques. You're on metaphors and similes, but
I think another one was repetition. This idea of like repeating, you know, words, sounds, phrases, sentences, or ideas. It's all basically a way of like hammering home a point and making something way more memorable. I can't remember if you were saying it on this call or previous, but the one with like, was it Tony Blair? It's like, what do you believe in? He was like, education, education, education.
Yeah,
you know,
it was on the voice note I sent you. Yeah. Which then actually we can jump into like the tricolon? The tricolon, which is, it is the same. Yeah, you're right. It's the tricolon, and it's also like repetition.
But this idea of like saying three things like in a row, like liberté, égalité, and fraternité.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of other I can't think of any off the top of my head where it's been used, but I know it's quite popular and sort of, especially politicians' speeches.
Yeah. But it's almost like the magic number. Like you normally, if you're putting it across points, it's normally like 3 points.
If you did like 5, people would be like, for fuck's sake, when is this guy going to shut up? Like, education, education,
and you guessed it, education.
There you go.
Yeah.
But yeah, the repetition is interesting because it's not even just repetition through the same speech, which of course it is also that like repeating a point that you want people to take away, but it's more like repeating the point across time. So it's like the classic Goebbels, the Hitler propagandist. He literally said, I can't remember what it was.
Oh yeah, I know.
Do you know the quote? It's something like repeat it until it's like
true.
Repeat something until it's true.
Yeah, no, it's a good one as well.
Repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth.
Kind
of thing. But that's kind of like the power of repetition, where it's like constantly you see it again and again and again and again. It's quite interesting because I wonder that's where like what do they call it, old wives' tales, or sort of like what's the best way of putting it, I don't know, but like stories that pass down through your family or through people through your family, which never get corrected, but because they've always been told throughout your family, you always believe them to be true. Not religious stuff, but like many stories about how to do specific things, like how to cook something, right?
Yeah.
And you find out after all this time you've been doing something completely in a weird way because you've been told all your life repeatedly that this is the way you do it, and that's because their parents told them. So your parents heard from their parents, and all of a sudden you were like, oh, hang on a second.
Yeah.
And that's in a weird way how sometimes the repetition of something or of like an idea can become true in your head without you ever realizing that it might not be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it is interesting because, like, the more we understand about the mind and how the mind works and all these kind of little idiosyncrasies of like how we behave, and like, for instance, alliteration, that's another one. It's like, using two words that start with the same kind of, phonetic phoneme in a sense. It's all these things we've just come across over time. But now we're starting to figure out more and more about like how we think and how we remember things and what sticks. And that's just going to add to this kind of, lexicon of techniques for rhetoric in a sense. Which I find kind of interesting.
I think that's a good point as well. The alliteration, like you said, sorry, about learning about how people remember stuff and memory, in terms of like the alliteration, it tends to stick in people's heads because it rhymes. It's almost like why, these big corporates, they're advertising. So like McDonald's, you got like the chime, the McDonald's chime. A lot of these companies spend loads of money just literally advertising just their like chime, just because then whenever you hear it, you're like, oh, that's that company. It's the association, like repetition as well, like just again until you're really familiar with it. And that's why also a lot of these advertising campaigns try to use alliteration as well. And they probably as well try to do some level of like rhyme or rhythm to what they say. Because it's more memorable, right? Yeah. And part of rhetoric is by making it more memorable, it sticks to people's minds. And because they can remember it, they give more importance to something.
Yeah. Oh, God. Look,
you got a bit of
red.
I was going to say, you got a bit off colour, mate.
Yeah, bloody hell. Mate, I look like a tomato. Jesus. I think my...
Is it dim?
My thing just died, which is a bit annoying.
It's okay, mate. You can look right.
Plug it in the meantime. Oh wow! Why am I so red?
You look really tanned, bro. I look so pasty here. I started to realize maybe this isn't blue. Maybe this is like a really like dark form of white. Is it? I just feel so white.
God, funny.
What else do I have here? I think, you've pretty much gone through most of the sort of like mini techniques.
Yeah.
But the other one I got here was the antithesis, which is like the contrast. So it's like, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Yeah.
So essentially that concept is like you say something and then you like inverse what you've just said afterwards to like, for dramatic effect, I guess.
Yeah.
I was thinking of trying to do one off the cuff. And then as I was thinking of it, I was like, it just doesn't work. It's just not the same. It's just not the same as that.
Come on.
I've seen the Coffeezilla did a really good one where he did it for like a solid 5 minutes, just like saying motivational things with like a contrast. Like I just don't know how people could do that off the cuff.
See, I find this stuff like off the cuff so interesting. I guess it's, the more you become familiar with how these like structures work of these things.
Yeah, you can kind of know what's good to say, right? Like
But it's you have to actively try and like pay attention or try to come up with
That's not what
them.
you could do for a job. That's what the job could do for you. I guess that kind of works.
Like, I guess you could take the same framework.
Yeah, like take exactly what they said, really. So like, that's not what you can get from a book, what a book can get from you. But that really doesn't work. But you get what I mean? Like, you can say it with like a dramatic voice and people be like, oh my God, he's inspirational, but I'm absolutely chatting with. And I feel like that's part of it. It's like, because it's like, it's quite tricky to understand. People just like, this guy's a genius. This guy is...
Mate, wise words, alliteration, bloody hell.
That's it.
Check us out.
Well, that was half the reason we did it, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
I actually think it was similar to
I think that was, everyone loves a bit of alliteration.
Of course, it's more memorable for sure.
All right, well, should we move on to the next point? Unless you had anything else.
No. Let's just move on. I mean, these next couple of notes are quite small ones. I made a note on it just because I thought it was quite interesting, because it talked about the next one's visual rhetoric.
Yeah.
And what I found quite interesting about it is it's true. It's like using the structure of cinematography and the way things are shot to persuade you / put you in an emotional place. So the example they gave was like the first shot was, seeing children happily playing in a playground, and then the next shot is like a silhouette like watching with like eerie music, and I was like, that's quite interesting, because that will obviously immediately imply something sinister is happening, or something unknown is about to come in and change this whole scene. Because what it is contrast. It's like happy kids playing, like sunny day, the scene is happiness, and then there's this like pan, and it's like scary music, and it's a silhouette. So that's, you don't know who that is. It's not the parent. It's not like a parent smiling where you'd be like, oh, that's obvious. That's the situation. It makes sense. So it gives you this level of like unease. And I just thought it's quite an interesting idea that, rhetoric could be visual, especially with the rise of, cameras and people being able to like film themselves essentially.
No, exactly. I think it's interesting that, it's not just about the speech or the text or, whatever's being spoken. It's also the circumstance with which you're seeing it in, whether that is on a YouTube video or whether that's in person, or whether, there's so much variability. And what I found interesting, I think one of the points was that you take a speech that you've seen in person or just on YouTube, and then you put over different visual imagery, and it can change the whole meaning of the whole speech. You could take one speech and then just do images of like World War II, and I wonder how it would be perceived.
Well, I guess because then they have to like bring the two together, right? Because like you see visually the World War, and then you hear them the speech, and you have to put two and two together. And I wonder that's also why you can never watch something that's really incongruent. So if you watch somebody talking really like upbeat, like children, like, I don't know, laughing, smiling, then there's like loads of dead bodies as like the video, right? Yeah. You would be so freaked out, because you would not be able to compute the complete contrast of like what is going on.
Or you'd be computing it differently. You might be like, okay, this guy's a psychopath.
Yeah, no, right? Yeah, agreed.
So you interpret it differently. I think that's what's super interesting, is that the interpretation has changed. Because if someone was talking about a war, but it was not a particular war, just war in general, and you could play that over loads of different footage of loads of different wars, and it would change your perspective of something. No,
for sure. I was just thinking about this idea of like the reason why something's so horrific is the contrast. So like the idea that like you're hearing kids laugh or something, like that's why we in horror movies is like kids like a giddy laughter when it's an eerie moment. It's because it's like dangerous, but at the same time you have the kid, it makes it even more sinister, because it's like these two things should not put mix, together in our minds.
And yet we do it, and yet we watch them.
Yeah, literally.
I'm just gonna put a light on quickly. Ooh.
Go for it. Is this to try and make yourself less red?
Yeah, God, there we go. Maybe that's a bit better. And my arm's
a little bit better. Your arm turned into a bit of a green screen there, I think. Oh, lovely. Oh. You're looking like what's the Silver Surfer a little bit there?
Yeah, I'm just gonna disappear in a minute. So that was visual rhetoric, wasn't it?
Yes. And it's just a little note. There wasn't really much to like in terms of what actionable stuff on that or anything, but it was just, I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, no, I think so as well. I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered when you are like, we'll get on to like rhetoric analysis.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is something to be to take into consideration.
So the next one I've got is the language containing ambiguity. So this was just more Another note I took of interest, it was from William Empson, is any verbal nuance have a slight which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language. However hard we strive, which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language. However hard we strive for clarity, such nuances creep into our words unavoidably. And it's this idea that words can be taken in two dimensions every time you say something. It can be taken in different ways depending on what the person brings to the language that's used, which I thought it's just an interesting note.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that there's like room for people to attribute their own kind of interpretations of something. You know, not everything can be pure clarity. There will always be like some ambiguity, and with that ambiguity, people will interpret something differently, you know, based on their personal experiences and who they are.
They do say like perception, like in the Matter with Things and stuff, is like an act of co-creation. It's like, you know, it's the world that comes to you, and then it's you that imprints yourself onto the world, and you create the world in a sense because you bring your own baggage to the thing. So like, for example, like the concept of love, let's just reuse that. You bring your own stories around love to the concept of love, so you distort it depending upon your own experience, right? So your concept of it would be different to somebody else's.
Well, it has to assimilate to your kind of knowledge.
It's similar to when somebody, you know, goes to watch the same movie. It's the same premise. It's like you bring your own expectations, your own I don't know, perceptions of how things should be. It's the same with language. They use certain words. You know, you bring your own perception into that as well. But
exactly.
Next, okay, the last one I think I've got before we go into the audience bit is the symbols. We kind of touched on it earlier, which is rhetoric tends to use symbols. And it's similar to what we kind of discussed earlier around the labels, I guess you could use, but they're essentially symbols too, right? Like a conspiracy theorist or whatever, or an anti-vaxxer, it conjures up a symbol of a specific type of human. And that is a symbol, in my opinion. So like rhetoric uses symbols to associate traits to, and then use to like appeal to ethos or pathos. So it uses these as ways. I do think the symbolic use of language like this is less logos. I don't think it's definitely less logos, because it's more appealing to like not strict logic, because basically what you're doing is you're saying this idea encapsulates a load of different things, and I'm going to apply it to you even though it might not fit you. Whereas logos would be a bit more like, well, this person's done this, this, and this. He's behaved this way.
Specificity.
It's more like specific. It's like this person has, you know, done this action. You know, that's obviously quite a bad action, but in the other time they've been like this, like almost like just more factual, right? Whereas the appeal through sort of symbols tends to be more ethos/pathos related, and I do think it's interesting to see how much is used these days in people's, you know, persuasion. Like less people are talking reason, or less people seem to be talking reason on the popular media channels, and on Facebook and Twitter, because obviously everybody's appealing to emotions and everybody's getting angry. So it's probably the most popular form of like rhetoric you're probably seeing these days. In comparison.
Did he also talk about, I can't remember if it was in this book, I don't know why I'm having a bit of a blank, but is it like action-based rhetoric or something? Or basically like he was talking about someone who, you know, when you break a bottle on the back of a boat before sending it off, and it creates this idea or this symbol of, you know,
yes.
You know,
right? No,
was it in this book?
It was in this book, and I can't remember exactly his point, but it was something along the lines of what you're saying, where like the action creates the symbol. Like if you smashed your bottle against a boat and it wasn't launching, you would be seen as like a vandal. You know, you'd be seen as somebody who's causing some trouble. Whereas in that exact moment, it's part of like the symbolic ritual, and therefore it's part of rhetoric. It's part of like, I can't remember the point, but
I don't know, kind of
see the point within that, right?
But exactly. Like, it was something about like action based, like linking actions with like rhetoric in a sense, or some kind of way of persuading. Like,
interestingly, you could say something like sacrifice in the past used to be part of that. Like, we're going to burn the witch, and then all of a sudden everything's going to be okay. So part of the rhetoric appeal was like, once we get rid of them, everything's going to be okay. Like, and it's Well,
it's almost like you're creating a symbol in itself, isn't it?
Well,
like normally you think
burning somebody alive
on the back.
I was going to say, normally you think burning somebody alive isn't something nice to do, but when it's a witch, oh my God, it's the best thing ever. It's like crack cocaine. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Everybody's there eating their popcorn, watching somebody burn at the stake, which is pretty horrendous to think about. But like, once again, it's the same action, but the specific context is given meaning, which is like positive.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I don't know why I didn't make more notes on that. I couldn't find it for some reason, but I
think it was quite a hard concept, and I still don't really particularly get it.
Yeah, I'd like to read into it some more, but weird.
Yeah. And I think the next is your big note here with the pick your audiences. I kind of get what your point.
Yeah, I think
go.
My point was that, like, you know, the way that you try and persuade people depends on who your audience is. So it depends who you're speaking to. And it was kind of interesting because they were talking about, you know, politicians speaking on the radio and trying to convince some people. So it depends who you're trying to talk to. And if you've got so many different audiences, let's say you've got one right in front of you, you've also got ones listening on the radio, this is also going to be played in the House of Commons, and you're a politician, then you have to try and choose which audience you're going to focus on, because you're not going to be able to please everyone in a sense. And so you've kind of got to weigh up or construct a speech that has little consequences or has good benefits, but in one particular area, you know. And I think it's very important to try and take that into consideration when you are debating something or doing a speech about something. And you have to try and, it was an interesting point that, like, if you're speaking to people who you're normally polarized to on certain ideas, you need to try and find commonalities and then work from that point up to your way of understanding the world. And I kind of think of it in like Hansel and Gretel kind of idea. You know, you lead breadcrumbs from where they are to your idea, because you can't just suddenly enforce your way of seeing the world on them straight away, because there's going to be a lot of friction. So you've kind of got to lead them into it gradually and start on like a commonality. And there's always going to be one, because we're all humans at the end of the day. But yeah, I just thought that it was important to kind of consider who your audience is, and then from that point, try and, you know, construct your speech accordingly.
Of course. I mean, it's similar to marketing, right? When you pitch a product to somebody, you've got to know the person you're pitching it to and what problems they're trying to solve. It's like, it's seen as a bit not brain dead, but tone deaf if you were a politician and you sort of started pitching, you know, the working class or the farmers through a more like, I don't know, and you came across as a bit too poncy and a bit like conservative-y and stuff kind of thing. You're basically not really messaging. You haven't got your message across to the audience, so that makes sense. So obviously it's worth knowing who your audience is and what they're going to respond to, what they care about, right? And it's almost why I think politicians come across as quite sleazy, because they have to change their message for every different pocket of society. And there's obviously infinite amount of categorizations you could technically make, because although we have like bigger, higher, you know, more abstracted stuff such as, you know, age, rough demographic, you know, socioeconomic status, whatever, there are still technically people within these different clumps who are like merged with other clumps, and you can never cut it up that clearly. Yeah, so exactly. It reminds me as well, because he did talk about this idea that, like, at the part of the book at the beginning, he was like, rhetoric is often thought of as like a superpower where you can just persuade everybody, like you're going to be like a master persuader. But the reality is it's a lot harder than that, because it's like when you pitch somebody, you have to kind of already know what's going to resonate with them, and what resonates with somebody won't resonate with somebody else. So if you're pitching the entire planet, you're going to fail, because there's nothing that can unite or, you know, apply or appeal to everybody, right? So
you can't take into consideration everything.
Which is where the, you know, finding the specific audience and thinking through the specific points that are going to resonate with them the most is where a lot of the work of rhetoric is done, I guess, or persuasion, and especially in politics, I can imagine.
And I think, like, relating it to your point about ambiguity before, is like, when there is ambiguity, people are going to interpret it in their own ways.
Yes.
And so there's always going to be ambiguity. So different audiences are always going to be interpreting things slightly differently. And you could use that to your advantage. You could try to imply something, not actually say it. Mm-hmm. And then you know that everyone else has this association to that, whatever it is that you're not saying, if you get what I mean. So you can kind of direct people down that kind of alley. And then you still have, my favorite word, you know, plausible deniability, because you don't actually say it, but you're leading it towards that point. And then you're like, I'm not going to say it. You guys already are thinking it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder if, like, a lot of politics, the reason why we get so many leaders who aren't very, like, they seem to, like, backtrack on stuff. They seem to, change. They're very, like, what's the word? Chameleon-esque, like conniving. They almost seem like they're changing their opinion all the time. It's because they're using that plausible deniability. Nobody's kind of just like saying it like, this is how it is. They want to avoid that, because if you do that, right, you then don't appeal to everybody, because you eventually put your bloody, flagpole in the ground and said, this is where I stand. This is my opinion on something. And therefore you're then open up to proper criticism. So it's good to just sort of like float around saying things which don't really, matter so much. Like you said, be ambiguous as possible, because you then have the, when somebody calls you on it, it'd be like, oh, well, you have the plausible deniability to be like, well, no, you've just interpreted that way. Like,
but I wonder if then that's why, like, we've started to be attracted towards politicians that just speak their fucking mind.
Because exactly why that's happening.
Because you get politicians that can't answer the most easy fucking question. Point in case, were you at that fucking party, Bojo? It just can't. Like, I'm sorry, but how is it so difficult? It's not. The whole reason is that it's a ploy to basically drag things out and not put yourself on, like, the spot like that.
Yeah, it's funny as well, because I was watching. There was like don't even know how I ended up finding this YouTube video. It was about a TikTok person who was getting a lot of hate, and one of the things they were saying is, like, when you respond to criticism, you get more hate. So they were, like, basically saying if she wanted to not be given so much hate, she should just, like, ignore the criticism or just not respond to it. And that's literally what the politicians do. Is like they just ignore it, because they know eventually, after a couple of weeks, it's going to be drowned out.
Because it's emotional, right? It's normally most of that is like emotional backlash.
Yeah, and you're right, because the moment you say something clear, like, oh yeah, I was definitely there on that day, it's like bang, you're out. So it's just like, oh, don't know, maybe I was.
But but then I think it is nice. You rarely ever get it, but when someone properly falls on their sword and be like, look, I will be the first to admit that it was wrong.
But it takes courage, doesn't it? Like, this is part of, like, the virtues that nobody seems to have.
Yeah, we don't really value that anymore.
Well, we do, but what's happened is people are so scared. I think that's what it is. I do think we value it. Like I think if somebody was to just stand up and be like, yeah, fuck it, I was there, I was, like, smashing shots, I was having the best night of my life. If Boris said something like that, fair enough, they'd probably be pretty tone deaf. But at least you know who he is, and I don't know, you know where you stand. Yeah. Whereas when you get somebody who's just not telling the truth, it's like, well, I can't really trust you, but at the same time I have to, because of the fact that you're the prime minister. So I'm in this really precarious position where there's nothing I can do about it yet. I don't really know where who you are. Whereas at least if he came out and he's like a liar, then you're like, okay, well, he's a liar, then I'm not voting for him next time. Whereas now it's been like, is he? Is he not? Well, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
But should we move on to the last one then?
Yeah, let's do it. Is this the
the different levels of, like, rhetorical analysis. And this is kind of similar to what we were talking about with, like, the steps with the canons, where you start with, like, what's your point, and you kind of move through it into style and stuff. When you're analyzing
side of the coin, isn't it?
So this is where you're, like, analyzing what people are saying, analyzing, speeches. The whole point is to be able to, like, be more aware of the use of rhetoric in day-to-day life. So he starts off with, like, the macro question. So it's, what is the nature of the speech? Like, what is the context? Is this like a politician's address? You obviously then know there's a lot riding on it, so therefore it's probably going to be a lot more calculated. And then it's like, how is it constructed, delivered? Was this delivered live? Was he off the cuff? Was he getting questioned? Or was it recorded in advance? Because obviously when stuff's recorded in advance, it's a lot easier to portray certain things. And then obviously the next macro question is, how is it appealing to your emotion, character, and sort of reason? Because therefore you can start seeing the sort of the building blocks of what's going on here. So are they appealing to, your sense of justice, your sense of who this person might be, or are they appealing to your reason? Because you can roughly, and in fact, you did say earlier, actually, it could be more than one, but it's also quite useful to try and distill from the message what they're trying to get across.
I agree.
And then once again, and after that, I think the macro analysis is where I would personally start, and I still haven't even tried to even begin thinking about some of the stuff I've read yet. But, like, the next part is obviously the micro analysis, such as the techniques like alliteration, the metaphors, the similes, the tricolons. But I feel like that's like the icing on top of the cake. If you can try and understand how people are trying to persuade you with the bigger picture stuff, like what is the purpose of this? How are they trying to appeal to me? That's where that's where your biggest gains are going to be, in terms of starting to see how people are, like, in the nicest way possible, manipulating you. Because everybody manipulates everybody in a sense that everything you do is having an effect on somebody else. So no matter what you do, people are using these kind of like naturally, these techniques, and some people are better with them than others. But it's worth knowing, like, maybe if somebody starts trying to sell you on something, how they're appealing to you. Are they appealing to your, are they appealing to your reason, or are they saying, if you buy this, you're going to be like a god, and therefore, it's more of like an emotional appeal to you, or like best sent, or like trying to convince you that you could, be somebody you're not, type of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think once you can understand their goal, then you can work backwards. Once you understand their point B, then you can try to go back and be like, okay, well, what methods are they using to get to point B? And then you can focus on the little micro things as well, like you just said, like all the different techniques that they're using, and then try to figure out where they're coming from. What's their point A? Because that way you've kind of laid out, their whole process, their whole direction and their goal and the way that they're trying to get that. I think that's really important. So I quite like the whole macro and micro way of viewing things. I think it broke it down to quite like a simplistic way of understanding it. So I think that was pretty important.
So I don't know if you have anything else, because I was going to say, should we attempt a rough overview? Because I think so.
Why not? These actionable ideas.
Okay. Let's go back to the start then. I guess the first actionable idea then would be, the thinking of rhetoric through the three different types of appeals they're going to try and make to you. So is it going to be an appeal towards character in terms of an appeal towards emotion? So if I remember it correctly, it is ethos for character. Are you going to appeal to somebody's ethos? Are you going to appeal to their emotion, which is pathos? Or are you going to appeal to their reason, which is logos? And obviously, as discussed earlier, this is the rough categorizations that every single sort of persuasion type conversation sort of goes towards. And you can think of most types of persuasion through these three categories. So such as, somebody trying to convince you to do something because you're a great person. Obviously, that's like an ethos thing. If they're trying to convince you of some sort of lofty goal or something that's going to make you feel good, that's more of like an emotional ethos. And then obviously somebody trying to convince you through facts, let's just say, that's more obviously an appeal to reason. It's arguable even after all this conversation that anything ever really gets through with reason, because emotions underlie most of the ways you act anyway. And if from the split brain stuff from the Antonio Damasio, whatever his name was, which said you can't act without emotions. So but I think it's interesting regardless, as a prong or as a start to the different types of rhetoric appeals.
Absolutely. And then I'd say next point is basically just trying to understand the structure of it. So what their main point is, or their issue that they're arguing about, how their speech or their argument is structured, the arrangement of it, the kind of choice of words that they use, these kind of different techniques as well. And then how they're delivering it. And also I think it's important to note what context they're in, whether it's because all these things have play a part in it. It's like where they decided to hold their rally. All these things change your perspective of how you're going to interpret something. So look at the bigger picture as well as the small, and try and understand the structure of how they make up their speech.
Yeah. And then I think my last one on top of it would be thinking about the sort of metaphors, frames, and symbols people are using when they're using their rhetoric, and sort of realizing that their choice of words that they use is a way of persuading you by using commonly accepted symbols, for example, or commonly accepted metaphors. They can frame a discussion rather than, the example being obviously what we spoke about earlier, which is, using concepts/symbols such as the characterizations of people who are conspiracy theorists or anti-vaxxers, or anything which has massively negative connotations, to basically use as a frame to basically dispatch any argument, or dispatch from, or to try and appeal to people's sort of emotions in a degree, to basically make them feel disgusted by other people's behavior, to convince you to I guess, what's the word? Disrespect? No. harbor sort of unfavorable judgments towards other people. So using words and using symbols to basically convince you of the badness of other people, and obviously to then try and form or try and structure the way you believe about a specific event. And then obviously, like I said, with the metaphors, watching the metaphors people use with when trying to convince you of things, as we have seen with the love is war, these love is a dance, both conjure up completely different images. And anybody who's good at rhetoric will be using specific metaphors to frame specific events in ways that are favorable.
I agree. I don't really have anything to add on that.
I mean, to be honest, listen to the rest of the podcast. It's much more in depth than that. It's quite hard to summarize all that.
Because it's
it's so much. There's so much to it. It's like everything to do with persuasion, everything to do with convincing somebody of something else. It's hard to just summarize in 2-3 points. But I think that's a wrap. Then it's done.
Well, there you have it, guys. A very short introduction to rhetoric. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Leave us a like or a comment, or even better, subscribe or follow to our channel. Next week, we are going to be summarising crucial conversations, thus adding to our repertoire of communication books. So if you feel like improving at your communication skills, then do make sure to tune in. But until then, have a good one.